Welcome to our latest transition webinar designed to help secure a sustainable future for your farm business. I'm your host, Johan Tasker, and as we always say at the beginning of our transition webinars, when we talk about a sustainable future here at Farmers Weekly, we mean a future that is sustainable financially, not just environmentally, and that means profitable farming. Our topic for this webinar is carbon storage, how to make it work for you, and we're going to do that. We're going to tackle that topic in its broadest sense. With so much change happening and lots of unpredictable events in the world, it's hard to plan for every eventuality, but being prepared and controlling the things that are within your grasp can help ensure stability and resilience in your farm business. This evening, we're going to discuss how carbon can benefit the soil and provide opportunities to make money, why biodiversity makes sense for arable and livestock farms, the routes to becoming a sustainable and productive farming business, and the risks and the opportunities of what we do day to day on the farm. To help us do this and more, we have some experts with us this evening. Our panel. Thomas Gent is UK market lead for Agrina, Europe's biggest soil carbon programme. He's the fourth generation on his family farm in South Lincolnshire, farming 800 hectares regeneratively since 2008. Isaac Murdy is a solicitor with Shakespeare Martineau. Isaac works with farmers and with funders, advising on a range of potential solutions to the net zero challenge, including things like anaerobic digestion plants, battery storage systems, and district heating networks. And last but by no means least, Liz Bowles is the Chief Executive of the Farm Carbon Toolkit. She's an expert in greenhouse gas auditing and carbon removals into farmland, with a practical understanding of the voluntary carbon market. We've got lots to get through, about 60 to 75 minutes. If you have a question, you'd like to ask something, please do submit that question using the chat box. We'd like this to be as interactive as possible. I'm not going to ask every single question to every single panelist. We'll sort of pick and mix, as it were. But I think I will start by just asking each panelist to just flesh out that brief introduction that I've just given, and talk for maybe a minute or so about what they do. Thomas, I'm going to start with you, then I'm going to go to Isaac, and then I'm going to go to Liz. So Thomas, tell me a little bit about Agrina.
Absolutely. Yeah, so first of all, I'll just mention our farm. So like you said, we farm 800 hectares. We're combinable cropping. We've been kind of using some of these regenerative no-till practices since 2008. I started to look at the carbon market really in 2020, really when I just wanted to understand the carbon performance of my farm, essentially. And I started to understand that there was this big opportunity, and people like, the Farm Carbon Toolkit and Liz was telling everybody that there was this opportunity that farmers could be a force for good, basically, and had the potential to store carbon in their soils. I saw that as also a commercial opportunity. So I set out to try and find some supporters and some funders to help me on that mission to be able to store more carbon in agricultural soils. I very quickly realized that we really need to do this in a proper way with a proper certification. And I came across Agrina. I like what they did. I wanted to use Agrina's program on my farm. They actually said I could only use it on my farm as long as I came to work for them. So that was kind of the deal that got struck up. And I joined Agrina in kind of at the start of 2021 when we first launched the program. Agrina is a carbon program, so we work with farmers in the UK and Europe. We work with about 4.5 million hectares now. That is kind of moving towards a more regenerative farming system on each one of those hectares. We're quantifying the amount of reductions and removals that take place on each one of those hectares, and then we're basically turning that data either into, there's kind of two options of how we essentially turn that data into money. The first one, as you've kind of initially mentioned, is the voluntary carbon market. We turn that data into a carbon credit, which is tradable on the voluntary carbon market. The second one, which we're seeing more and more, is into the supply chain, where supply chain players essentially are asking for more and more in-depth data into the carbon performance of the crops they're buying. And that data that we're collecting and verifying for the farmers can also be passed through the supply chain. So we kind of work with farmers to, collect data, and in order to do all the verification and then either supply that data into the supply chain market or the voluntary carbon market, depending on the demand effectively, and then obviously rewarding and paying the farmer for doing so. So we kind of have a fair amount of experience. We've been doing that for 4 years. We're kind of going into our 5th year now. And yeah, looking forward to more questions.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Thomas. Isaac, I'll go to you next.
Thank you very much. So my name's Isaac. I'm a solicitor, as Johan said, and my original area of practice was energy and utilities law, and working with farmers in getting renewable energy projects off the ground. I started to see the opportunity for farmers to be making more money from the environmental side of their business, and actually farmers generating value that they weren't being paid for when it came to carbon sequestration, but also things like natural flood management. And as part of my work in the energy sector, I had some experience with the European Carbon Trading Scheme, now the UK Carbon Trading Scheme, the ECTS, and mandatory declarations that needed to be undertaken by the big publicly limited companies. So these are like the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, and then work on nature-related financial disclosures, all of which feed down the supply chain, as Thomas was just saying, so that people like yourselves have to provide information about the sort of work that you're doing, your climate impact, carbon impact. All of that then also leads into the kind of work we do with greenwashing claims, where companies are saying that they're doing stuff that is good for the local environment and for the global environment, but maybe not quite as good as they'd like it to be. As well, companies that are creating voluntary markets for carbon, nature, or social credits, which aren't as robust as maybe they could be, and all of that undermining the value for farmers. So my ideal clients and the sort of work I really enjoy doing is matching farmers, funders, and buyers all together, so that we've got these kind of virtuous circles where companies that are trying to do right are able to pay farmers for the public good that a lot of the time they are undertaking anyway, notwithstanding that they're not being funded, and actually they're doing it on their own penny.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Isaac. Liz, over to you.
Thanks, Johan. Evening, everybody. It's great to be on this webinar this evening. I'm Liz, and I'm the Chief Exec of the Farm Carbon Toolkit. I'm also a farmer in Devon, so I kind of have a sort of practical insight into all of this as well. We're facing exactly the same kind of issues as other farmers, trying to work out what to do in this space. So at Farm Carbon Toolkit, we're very clear. We exist to support farmers to understand their greenhouse gas emissions through our Farm Carbon Calculator, which measures both emissions and also carbon sequestration onto and into farmland, as well as having a team of advisors who work directly with farm businesses to help them to take action. And I think that's so important, because increasingly we're seeing supply chains requiring their farmers to complete a footprint, but then very little follow on in terms of so what. So that's where we work. And as an organisation, we're never going to be involved in the voluntary carbon market ourselves, but we see a real need for farmers to have that accurate information in order to enable them, if they want to enter these markets. And I would say, at the moment, there's no need to rush into these markets, because it's likely that the values for carbon will go up over time. But what I would say in this space, and it's something that as somebody operating in this space, I'm seeing it increasingly. And in fact, I was listening to a program the other day where I think it was probably the aviation sector were abandoning carbon offsets in favor of, first of all, working as hard as they can to reduce their own emissions. And I think that is a really critical aspect, not only for the businesses that farmers might be selling offsets to, because at the moment there is an argument that it's cheaper to buy offsets than it is to reduce your emissions, which ultimately doesn't actually help us to overall reduce emissions to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And I don't know about some of the people on the call, but I live in Devon, and Saturday was terrifying. I don't want too many days like that, thank you very much, with sheets of corrugated iron flying all over the place. And I think we've really, the days of just sort of talking about it in the abstract have gone. So yeah, that's what we do, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation too, because it's such a live topic.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Liz. And you touched on a number of things there, from offsetting to climate change, farmers on the front line of climate change. We're going to look at those more in depth throughout this webinar. I'm going to stick with you though, Liz. We have got some questions that have been pre-submitted, and we're going to go through some of those. But when we talk about carbon storage, Liz, what exactly do we mean in farming terms, at least?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, typically what we're talking about here is taking carbon dioxide out of the air and storing it in vegetation or in soil, okay? And that can be temporary or permanent. And I mean, the way that, I guess the way that these voluntary carbon markets started was generally either about avoiding emissions and creating an offset that way, or generally through planting trees and storing carbon in woody biomass. And actually, that is fairly well understood in terms of the rate of deposition of carbon into trees, but perhaps not well understood that for the first 10 years, if you think about it, a tree's not very big for the first 10 years, unless you're going to grow Paulownia. And therefore, you're not going to store a lot of carbon in the first 10 years. And Becky Wilson, our great technical director, talks about trees being in their teenage years when they grow like heck, and they will store carbon. So that's carbon storage into either woody biomass or indeed into hedges. That's quite, for farm businesses, that can be a very reliable way to store carbon, so long as you don't really trim your hedges every year and hack them back to within an inch of their lives. Having said all that, probably the biggest ability to store carbon on farms is into soil. And the kind of the stat that we use at Farm Carbon Toolkit is for every 0.1% increase in soil organic matter, and I think that's down, I'm going to get this wrong because I was asked this morning in the Westminster Food Forum, I think that's down to 30 centimetres, but please don't hold me to that. It's equivalent to about 9 tonnes of carbon per hectare being stored, and that's huge. However, that may not be permanently there. And I think that's the bit we really have to understand with soil and farmland, that the whole point of farming is generally that we are, you sequester carbon into plant life. Some of that can get down into the roots and thence into the soil. But then depending on how you manage that soil, some of it will probably be released next year. So that's what we mean by carbon storage. It's getting that carbon out of the air and either into soils or into non-crop biomass.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now, I'm going to go to Thomas. We know that this sort of thing has benefits environmentally. It also has benefits agronomically, but increasingly financially as well. So just explain that sort of, flesh out that what a greener do and how this works from a financial point of view, because I'm sure, especially with the pressures on farming at the moment financially, people are going to be really interested in knowing more about this side of things as well.
Absolutely. So first of all, I think I would say there's kind of two buckets of financial kind of benefit that I would glean. The first one, which I think you're probably not asking me about, but we can talk about if you want, and I'm sure Liz has got some opinions on as well, is really about the cost saving benefits of having better soil on your farm. Nothing to do with selling it or anything like that, but just the cost benefits of being able to reduce fertilizer, having more consistent yields, all of that kind of stuff. There's a huge cost saving in that. We see that on our farm. We can talk about that if you want. I think what you're probably asking me more is about the kind of more carbon market potential of soil carbon effectively.
Well, let's do the first bit of that, the agronomic bit. I guess it's going to have a benefit in terms of what you're producing from a farming and food production point of view. Let's just cover that, because that is interesting in itself. And then Thomas, take us through what a greener do. And while you're doing that, I will try and turn off my email notification, because it's annoying. It's annoying me, so it must be annoying everybody else as well.
I mean, I'm sure Liz has got some opinions on this as well, but I'll start anyway. I'll start off for 10. So we know that when you let's talk about my practical experience, right? So we've been trying to farm more for our soil since 2008, so about 17 years ish. The first stage of that was moving to a no-till farming system completely. We have been now 100% no-till since then. We have done little bits of, I can't claim to be strictly Bible no-till. We have done little bits every now and again. So that's the benefit of doing that, and the soil health improvements we've seen over those periods of time. When we first started this kind of more transition, our soil organic matters were around 4%-ish. We had some tests done the last couple of years ago, and we're now kind of in that 8-9% realm. We have increased pretty massively. And what that means materially is I use a lot less fertilizer. I get a much healthier crops and much more consistent yields. And the way that we measure that is I do some benchmarking, financial benchmarking with AHDB against kind of a group, not against, let's say, with a group of farmers locally. And we're always performing about, it kind of depends on the year, but I think over the last 5-year average, our margin is about 25 to 30% improved compared to conventional neighbours, and with pretty consistent yields. Our yields, they dip definitely at the start, but now they're pretty similar to any comparable farming system really. So we're definitely a lot more profitable per hectare just from being a more kind of soil focused farming business. Liz, I don't know if you know.
Yeah, I've just a few thoughts to add to that. And I would say that there's definitely improving soil health. How you measure that, you can measure it in all sorts of ways. For me, it's about soil structure, soil organic matter, the life in the soil, as well as its ability to be resilient. And this probably is the bit that Thomas hasn't mentioned so much, because it's not so immediately relevant as a farmer, but it's going to become ever more important, the resilience of soil, which is healthy. And what I mean by that is two really important functions. It will hold more water, so potentially it will slow water down, so it will be resilient in the face of floods. And actually, I think going forward, some farmers should be paid for that, because they'll be preventing water getting into rivers as quickly, not necessarily through sacrificing fields at the bottom, but actually in how they manage their soil, so that the soil itself can simply hold more water. And it's not just floods, it's also droughts. So soils that are in good health can simply cope more with the kind of extreme weather events that we're going to have more and more of. And I think that will almost become a requirement in order to be able to carry on growing reasonable crops in the future. And also things like, if you've got good soil health, livestock don't poach fields as much because the soil structure is better, all these things. And yeah, and absolutely agree with Thomas that kind of thinking that soil health is a nice to have and it's only about carbon, absolutely not the case. You know, and more I see farmers who talk about how they first of all think about how they manage the soil in order to support the life in the soil, in order that that soil can produce crops. And I think that's probably it's a difference. You know, it takes me back to, I was once, I think I'd gone over to Ireland to talk about something, and I sort of made the point that in the past we even referred to soil as dirt. And, you know, that meant that in very much farmers might have thought of soil as simply the growing medium to which you add inputs. And that, I think that understanding is fundamentally changing. And a good thing too, as far as I'm concerned, because soil is not simply somewhere where things happen to be put. It's actually the fundamental enabler of crop production.
Yeah, I'd just like to, in our experience, partly working with property developers who are looking to get planning permission in areas where the catchment is influenced by agricultural land, we're seeing massive constraints because of the nutrient neutrality requirements. So, you know, the idea that you can't have more than a certain amount of your NPs and Ks going into the rivers. And obviously, artificial fertilizers are contributing towards that nutrient level. Combine that with the flood reducing powers of healthy soil and healthy farm land, and we're seeing real opportunities which are starting to be investigated, where house builders are one of your potential funders who can, in cooperation with farmers, in creating a long-lasting arrangement with those farmers, can demonstrate a nutrient reduction following their development, basically using some of their profit from the development which can't go ahead at the moment, giving that to farmers and saying, can you please change how you're using your farm, make these changes upstream so that we can operate downstream? Because at the moment, these developers are spending millions of pounds building new wastewater treatment works to try and ameliorate, to reduce the nutrients from residential properties at great cost, which that money could be better spent with farmers who could have a much bigger impact for much less money. And as Thomas was saying, without reducing the effectiveness of their fields.
Thank you. Thanks, Isaac, and thanks, Liz. So that sort of explains that side of things in terms of the agronomic benefit, in terms of the wider benefits in and as of itself. Thomas, explain the Agrina program and how you can directly benefit from doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was a little bit of a tangent, but I think what this means is there's so much exciting opportunities, right? Because this is literally a win-win-win. There isn't a losing situation I see here. You're going to get better financial performance from your fields. There's now SFI income available, and there's also now this private market, which Agrina obviously operate in. So in simple terms, how Agrina operates, we operate a yearly cycle. We work harvest to harvest, so a yearly cycle. We work with farmers in 20 different countries. I work with farmers in the UK. The first thing we need to do when we onboard and start to work with a farmer is to understand their baseline. And what that means is we need to be able to understand the current situation of your farming business and soils. We do that on a field by field basis because we know every single field tends to be slightly different and have slightly different quirks and maybe slightly different history and story behind it. So what we need to do is understand how is this field, the kind of physical characteristics that cannot be changed. So maybe the soil type, obviously where it's located, size, that kind of thing. We then need to understand the activities that have taken place on that field in the last 5 years. And that might be, what different crop types have been grown, how has the system been kind of operating for the last 5 years. we can then that allows us then to set a baseline. We can then give kind of estimations of, if you were to do X, Y, and Z different thing on this field, if you were to, I don't know, add a different cover crop into the rotation, you know, move to a spring cropping system more predominantly, whatever it might be, it kind of doesn't matter what it is. But whatever, we can model different scenarios that you might like to take up on that field. We can then give you an estimation of the carbon benefits of doing that. And because we've been trading in the market for the last sort of 4 years, kind of moving into 5 years now, we can then give you an estimation of the financial value of that kind of carbon benefit as well. So it's really, and that's kind of how all of these schemes work really, and how carbon storage should work. Is the most crucial bit is to set a baseline and get an understanding of the potential, and make sure that's audited and verified to a standard that makes it possible to do anything with. And then that kind of trading bit, I really see as something a little bit separate. And that's kind of a second question. The first most important bit is, do you want to, the first most important bit is you need to measure it and you need to understand what's actually happening. Whether you want to trade it or not is kind of a second question. And something that's very dependent on the farm kind of business and how, you know, where they're up to and things like that. But I cannot stress enough, making sure you measured it to a verified standard in today's age is you know, essential for any farm business operating, in my mind.
And hence, Liz, that's where the Farm Carbon Toolkit comes in, yes?
Yeah, it is. And what I would say in this whole space is that at the moment, within the voluntary carbon market, which I think is primarily what Thomas is talking about and operating in, that there's no absolute kind of standards. And the Sustainable Soils Alliance a couple of years ago had a go at doing this. And there is now, with the what's it called? The ICVCM Integrity
Council.
Integrity Council, the voluntary carbon markets, has come up with sort of the 10 principles. And I think it's worth sort of mentioning a couple of them, because I think at the moment it's really up to the person buying those offsets what they need to see. But I suspect over time, what will become more necessary is that any scheme that farmers enter into to be rewarded for storing more carbon, whether it be into soils, or primarily probably it will be into soils if it's coming from farmland, that the practices that those farmers enter into should be additional to normal farming practice. And I think, you know, that at the moment, that isn't probably that well defined as to what's considered to be additional, but I suspect over time it will be. And the other area is the permanence of the soil carbon storage, if it's soil carbon. And I think, given the remarks I said earlier about sort of soil carbon being eminently temporary in terms of its ability to be sequestered and also to be lost, I think that's really important. And something increasingly I think will become important is what kind of qualifies anybody to start to trade carbon. At the moment, if you are managing to create carbon offsets through removing carbon into soils and non-crop biomass, it's able to sell that. However, if you're within your farming activities, and I would say as a farmer, it's impossible not to have any emissions. It's actually impossible. You know, we spend day in, day out looking at farm businesses, and I can tell you fairly clearly that if you're an arable farm, chances are 70% of your emissions will come from the use of nitrogen fertilizers. And from the work that we've done, probably it will amount to, in total emissions from arable farming, say 2 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per hectare per year. So, and I think the time will come when almost that eligibility to start to trade carbon will be dependent on offsetting your own emissions first, on farm probably. And I think that's something that in the fullness of time will become a necessity. And in a way, that's exactly what, when I mentioned the aviation industry has decided to do. It's decided to try and not that it can do it. In fact, agriculture and the stewardship of land is probably one of the best ways to remove carbon. It's low tech and it blooming well works.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks. I'm going to come to Isaac in a moment, and because I'm conscious, Isaac, that you've sat there patiently, and this is going to be an opportunity for you to have your say. But just on the surface of it, this looks very, very simple. So, Liz, just tell me how much it's going to cost me, ballpark, to baseline my farm using the Farm Carbon Toolkit.
Well, you'll be delighted to hear, Johan, that it's free. Any farmer can go onto our calculator, and I can almost guarantee that within 5 minutes, you'll be confronted with a nice little set of fields to put data into. And you then start to build up your donuts for each part of your footprint, which then starts to tell you where your hotspots are. However, and it's not to do with putting data into the calculator, but if you are looking to establish your baseline as the precursor to wanting to look at entering into the voluntary carbon market, the bit that's going to cost you is actually establishing what your opening carbon stocks are, especially if you're looking to trade credits based on soil carbon sequestration. And that bit, I mean, at the moment, the best practice recommendation is that manual soil tests are undertaken. And then depending on the variability of your soil, whoever you engage will tell you just how many soil samples you need to take in order to come up with, what do we call it, a realistic estimate of your carbon stocks. It will never be precise, simply because, unless you dig up every square inch of soil, you're never going to know. So that's the bit that costs, but establishing what your business emissions are is not that difficult. And I think this is an area where I suspect at some point remote sensing will help us. I don't think it's there yet because the data sets that are used within remote sensing aren't very granular, but they can get better. And I think also because of the sort of seriousness and urgency of the situation, I think we will have to agree what we consider to be good enough as the evidence for that soil carbon stocks at the beginning. And I think I'm not quite sure, Isaac probably knows better than I do how that conversation is moving along. You're nodding, Isaac, so I hope you can tell me, because I do.
Just before you do though, Isaac, just Thomas, how much is carbon sort of worth in terms of the agreement program? So we've sort of established that there's other than soil testing, there's probably quite a low barrier to entry to do this stuff. It doesn't require a huge amount of investment. So that's the sort of the cost side. But in terms of the benefit side, how much benefit are we going to get financially? And then we're going to get into this with Isaac.
Yeah, I think just to also build on what Liz said, so we've obviously been trading in the kind of carbon market for, like I said, 4 or 5 years now. There is a big difference between what I would call a management tool going on to the Cool Farm tool, Farm Carbon Calculator Toolkit, whichever kind of carbon calculator you want to use. They're free, they're really good. Using them as a management tool to understand your business, what's going well, maybe what's not going well, what you can change, things like this. There's quite a big difference between doing one of them and doing I don't know what you call it, a tradable carbon market assessment, baseline assessment. So basically, because you need to be able to evidence and prove in a proper program type format to a purchaser that what you have just kind of pulled numbers out of the air actually is real and did definitely happen, because nobody's going to pay for you, obviously, for just kind of making up some numbers, right? We need to actually make sure that they are fact, or as close as possible. So that's kind of what our job is, right? Our job is to work with farmers. We work with we have two different independent auditors that audit us and audit our farmers to make sure that what they're kind of saying actually did happen in the field. The remote sensing is really super interesting. We can dive into that if you want to. A couple of years ago, we purchased a company called Hummingbird Technologies. We've because of the data and the AI is talked about a lot more in machine learning, but it is really going to change everything. And we can now very granularly tell to a very high accuracy. It even surprises me, to be honest. What crop type you grow in your field. Did you grow a cover crop? What tillage practice you did? What you did with your residues? We can now tell all of these things remotely. Just by satellite. That has two benefits. It allows us to check that it did actually happen. It also allows us, the farmers, to really not be able to have to input too much, because we already know lots of different things about the farm and the field and the shape and the size and the crop type and the history. So what that means is it makes onboarding baseline super smooth, super easy, and we already check what's happened. So yeah, sorry, Johan, just back to your question, the kind of value. So as I said, there's two different markets. There's the supply chain market, there's the voluntary carbon market. If you're asking me kind of more specifically about the voluntary carbon market, the price definitely depends on the standard you're issuing to and the audit capabilities you have. More strict audits have more command a higher price. But the kind of rough prices I would see in the market is somewhere between, it kind of depends on the market, and this is going to be a bit of a range, but somewhere between 30 and 50 pounds per ton of carbon is kind of what I'm seeing back to a farmer. It can get a lot higher if you're kind of a farmer that's individually trading to a local business. But on a kind of aggregated European scale, that's kind of the range of prices I would see. And then the number of credits per hectare, the yield is obviously really important. And that's, again, a big range because it depends what you're doing on your field, but somewhere between kind of half a credit a hectare up to 2 credits a hectare, depending on what you're doing. Interestingly, we're starting to see the supply chain. Some places match that kind of income, kind of the, let's say, 50, 60 pound a hectare type income. Some places actually beat it. So it really depends. It very much depends, as it does with nutrient neutrality and biodiversity net gain, where your farm is located. Thank you.
But a substantial a range, but 50 to 60 pounds per hectare is going to be something. It's going to be there or thereabouts. It's certainly worth having. I'm going to now bring Isaac into this, because like any sort of emerging fledgling market, things are can be quite complicated. I'm not going to people talk about the Wild West, or people piling in. How do you know what to do, who to go with, at what time to jump into to this? And as I was saying before, especially at the moment, people are looking to optimize and maximize their margins from the land that they have, in addition to sort of food production. What should farmers be looking at, Isaac, in terms of this?
Okay, so I think the first thing to mention, because we've been saying the voluntary carbon market a few times, which might lead some people to ask, what's the involuntary carbon market? And that's, well, there are certain energy intensive businesses that have a legal obligation under the UK emissions trading scheme to reduce their emissions. And if they don't reduce their emissions by a certain amount, then they have to pay effectively a fine by buying a load of credits from a central repository. Now, this emissions trading scheme, the involuntary scheme, doesn't affect everybody. It only affects the very biggest companies, and there are many problems with how it's set up. There's lots of free credits that are given. It drives the price down. But because there's this, that is, however, the biggest source of carbon credits that we see in the market, particularly with the energy companies. Steel, it's one of the reasons that we have some difficulties in the UK with heavy industry. That big market sets the price for everyone else, because if you can buy a ton of sequestered carbon or reduced carbon from a government certified and stamped location, then you've got to ask yourself why you would go to someone else, someone who isn't stamped with this government seal of approval. And I'm sure Thomas will be happy to know that his estimate of price is pretty much bang on for the UK emissions trading scheme. Next month, the cash out price is £41.84 per tonne, because I did check before we came onto the webinar. That's the price that you're gonna pay if you're Tata Steel, if you're Jaguar Land Rover, if you're Eon, just to pull some names out of the air. Now, as a farmer, you're not really wanting to compete in that market necessarily. You've got, well, if you were going to compete in that, you've got so many more hoops that you've got to jump through, the bureaucracy, and also you're dealing with big entities that aren't going to be interested in the amount of carbon your farm can sequester. Instead, you're going to be wanting to look at, like Thomas was saying, some of these other voluntary credit type markets that you can stack onto your nice voluntary carbon market. So not all carbon credits are stackable. So for example, the Woodland Carbon Code, which is a brilliant piece of, brilliant contract, used it a number of times. I like it in a lot of ways. It's a very advanced piece of sort of contractual architecture, but also scientific architecture. Really good way of saying this is how much carbon you're going to get from this many trees on this amount of land. Unfortunately, it's really difficult to stack things with that. So we're wanting to be looking at these voluntary markets, the kind of thing, and the voluntary credits, the kind of things that Liz is talking about and Thomas is talking about. And that's where, and effectively as a farmer, you want to go to a local business and say, I'm going to offset the carbon dioxide that you produce from your Volvo garage down the road. But not only am I going to do that, I'm also going to create habitats for badgers and stoats and little robins. And I'm going to take pictures of the robins that are living in the hedges that you've helped to fund. And I'm going to say, this is your robin. And you can send a Christmas card to all of your customers saying, look at the biodiversity, the nature, the social good that we're doing, as well as being carbon neutral. And that's where you're creating a product out of land stewardship, which is what a lot of farmers are doing anyway. And that's the way that you're wanting to manage your farm, and other people in your local area are wanting to manage it as well. The last point I'd say, when we're talking about these voluntary markets, all you're needing to satisfy is your accountant at the end of the day, your carbon accountant, who is going to say, this is how much carbon you've produced in a year, and this is how much carbon you've locked away to counterbalance it. And it's the accountants of whoever you're selling these things to as well that you're wanting to explain it to. At the moment, you can buy credits from anyone who can create a convincing argument that their credits work. And so you'll see a lot of very well certified companies, some of which we act for, who will say that they have a ton of carbon dioxide that is based from a plantation in Kenya or China or India, and they will be able to, and there's a good argument to say it's a lot cheaper to plant a hectare of trees in the developing world than it is in the UK. And that's true, but it's also a lot harder to point to how that bit of land is being managed, whether those trees would have been protected or planted anyway. And you might have seen some big name, or relatively big name celebrities. Mr. Beast is one particularly famous. He's a YouTuber who made a big deal about the carbon he was sequestering by protecting land in the Amazon. There were trees that were never going to be cut down. They were nowhere near any roads. No loggers were interested in them. He just paid a few quid to say, yeah, that's fine. That's protected. That's in my name. This is where UK farmers are able to come in and completely steal a march on their competition by saying, here's the hedge. Here's the forest. here's the land that I have changed what I'm doing, and talk to Thomas, he'll be able to tell you how much more carbon my land is sequestering. Talk to Liz, she'll be able to tell you what my baseline was and what I've been doing. It's in the UK. It resonates with the customers who are interested in these offsets. So to sum it all up, stacking. Like everything in farming, stack your benefits.
The super, I completely agree. And the bit that we definitely see in the market is basically tangibility in this market is what trades effectively. And it makes so much more sense for a UK company to be supporting whatever kind of carbon removal activity is happening within the UK, or even within 10 miles of their factory, out the window, whatever it is. We work with some buyers where they can see the fields that out of the window that are doing good stuff, and they sit in the office, right? So they can see the fields, they can see what's happening every day. So that kind of tangibility and locality is really what brings the value effectively, because it makes it so much more real.
And also, I guess it's going to have, in this day of ESG, environmental, social governance and stuff, it's going to have a social value, isn't it, to the local community? And if you're doing something in the UK, funding something in the UK, it will have that sort of social benefit within the UK as well. So
I was speaking to he's a senior executive at a FTSE 100 company. He was saying that for them, the E of ESG is a voluntary tax that they've taken upon themselves. They've said, we're going to offset our carbon emissions. They're just going to buy credits if they need to. And their customer base isn't really, they say, we need this, but we're not impressed. What they are impressed by is the S, it's the social benefit. And that's where the UK farmers, stewards of UK land, can make a massive difference, particularly if you're able to say to the people who are downstream of your factory or the fields that you're changing how you manage them. Do you remember how you used to get flooded a lot? Do you remember how you don't now? That's all because of, or partly because of, the work we're doing to make our land more spongy.
Yeah. That's interesting, Isaac, because what that's going to need, though, is farmers working together, isn't it? Because if you're going to protect watercourses, or rather slow the flow, then everybody, all the farmers in that catchment are going to have to think about what they can jointly do. And personally, I think that's really exciting. And I think that's one of the areas where perhaps landscape recovery has kind of got it right. But I don't underestimate the challenge of sort of galvanizing groups of farmers to want to do the same thing at the same time. But I think that is one of the opportunities of where we are at the moment.
Yeah.
Isaac, there's also going to be it's important, there's a reason that we've got a solicitor on this panel, and not just a solicitor, but a solicitor who's an expert literally within this field, and that's because you are going to need to take some advice on this. It's you're going to have to read the small print, or get somebody to read the small print who understands this, because it can be that there are opportunities out there, but it's important that it's done in the right way, because you want to do the right thing yourself. You don't want things to come back and bite you later on. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think you said it at the beginning of the webinar. While the Wild West analogy is used a lot, but there is no law governing the voluntary market. And like many areas that the UK was at one point a leader on in terms of legislation, we have been woefully slow in legislating and regulating this market. One of the pet peeve of mine is the green taxonomy. That the Europeans have a green taxonomy. It's not perfect, but it's there. We're still to consult on it, despite having been the leaders in saying and the green taxonomy is just a list of what things are green and what aren't. Can we agree on what's green or not? They've got 27 countries that have agreed what is green and what isn't, and we've not started. So pet peeve to one side, what are the risks if you're a farmer looking to sign up to one of these schemes, or if someone comes along, smiling and saying, "Oh, trust me, sign up to my scheme, it'll be good." One of the things you've got to bear in, the first question is, do you own the land? Because if you're a tenant, you may be the steward of that land, but you're not necessarily able to bind it long term. And if you try and do that, that can be the end of your tenancy. That can cause you all sorts of problems with your lease of the land. So definitely one where you need to get one of the, an agricultural specialist solicitor. Maybe some of the farm advisors are, wised up to this as well. But anything with land, you want to be going to a solicitor and saying, "Am I allowed to do this?" Because it's too important not to. The second thing is, if you've gone through the steps with the landowner, the freeholder, got their permission, or if you own the land in the first place, you've got to think about duration. Carbon sequestration, when the carbon's in the ground, we want it to stay there. The problems that we're in now are because carbon that was in the ground, or under the sea, has been taken out and then turned into gas. We want to keep the carbon there for a long time, and so a lot of these contracts, particularly in the voluntary market, but in some of the more regulated market, Woodland Carbon Code, for example, can be for very, very long times.
Yeah,
we've seen clients who brought us contracts for 99 years, which is effectively you're selling the land. And they're so strict on what you're allowed to do that you've no longer got the benefit of that bit of land. Now, it's not necessarily a problem if you enter a 99-year contract to sequester carbon if you want that land to become a forest. If you're happy, or if you're happy for it to be a wildflower meadow long term, because there are ancillary benefits, there are additional good things for the surrounding fields. If you say, actually, I'd really like just this big bit of marshland in the middle of my farm because it's going to be good for birds coming in, it's going to have benefits of getting rid of pests, it's going to be just, I want ducks there because I like ducks. You've got whatever reason you've got, if you want to turn a bit of land into something, but you can't find the economic arguments persuasive enough to do that, then look at one of these schemes. And if it chimes in and someone says, "Look, you're 20% or you're 80% of the way there, let me give you the next 20% of financial push to make it make sense," brilliant, lock this in for 99 years. But you've also got to consider what else you're able to do with the land. And so we've seen some really interesting work, and this only really works on massive estates, but where you're wanting, where you've got agroforestry, because the amount of carbon you can sequester for an agroforestry scheme, much less than if you're just growing trees. And similar, actually, and there's some arguments to say actually much less than if you've got soil-based carbon sequestration. And I think that the lack of an official code for soil may make people a bit more wary about the credits there, but I think that the science is building, and the arguments that actually this land can sequester much more carbon even than a forest sometimes, I think that is getting more persuasive and people are agreeing with it more. So to summarize, the things that you need to watch out for in these contracts: are you allowed to do it with your own land ownership? And are you preventing yourself from doing other things that you might want to do?
yeah.
The last thing is, are you getting enough money for it? Because the prices right now, 40 quid a tonne is maybe quite nice, but you could be looking at £100 a tonne. There's some estimates that have said it'll be £300 a tonne. That normally happens at the end of an accounting year when HSBC or Santander or one of the big PLCs realizes that they're a long way off hitting their carbon targets and they need to buy credits and there's not many left in the market. Maybe you want to be in a position to sell those credits at the end of the year, or maybe you want to be in a position to get a bit of the profit that whoever you've agreed to sell your credits or your pending issuance units, which is another technical term, maybe you want to be able to get a bit of their profit as well.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm going to go to Thomas. I'm going to go to Liz, and I'm going to ask you about your pet peeves and things that questions that people should be asking, because there are, Thomas, other carbon programs out there, but some of them are not as good as others. So perhaps without naming other names, but what are the questions that people should be asking when they're considering a carbon program, as it were? And I'm going to then ask Liz the same. You the same question.
Yeah, we'll see if we agree, Liz. It'll be
Well,
interesting.
I don't know. Yeah, go for it.
So I've obviously I've been around in the carbon, well, let's say I don't know what you call it, soil regen carbon space for probably most of the time it's been really publicly talked about, and there's definitely been a big it's evolved really, really quickly, to be honest. If you kind of looking at it 4 years ago, it's completely different to how it is now, and I'm sure in 4 years' time it's going to get even better. But the fundamentals have still not really changed, and to be honest, they're very similar to what Isaac said. Is the first thing you need to do, you really do need to. There's a lot of people. My biggest pet peeve is there's a lot of people that say, "Oh, we need to wait until." I don't know, there's some miraculous solution and perfect way to measure it. There probably is going to never be completely 100% perfect way, but we're always getting better and better and better and better over time. And by being with it, you're going to be involved in that improvement and as the whole system develops. But what I can fundamentally definitely say is you're not losing anything by starting to understand your current position, setting a baseline, and understanding the potential on your farm. That's the biggest pet peeve I have, is people that say it's better to wait. It's not better to wait because you're just missing out on years. Absolutely, as Isaac said, it could be good to wait to trade, and we can have a big discussion about when's the best time to trade. And there's probably same as grain trading, right? There's nobody has the perfect answer to that, and we can debate it for as long as you like. But I hope we all fundamentally agree you need to measure, and you need to audit, and you need to get an understanding and a baseline now, because nobody's ever going to issue you a baseline for what you started doing 2 years ago. No, because it's unprovable, basically. So I cannot stress that enough, probably, is you need to be setting a baseline, understanding what you're doing this year, because nobody's ever going to go back and set a baseline for 4 years ago. Whether you trade it or not, who knows? And really, I don't really mind. It's up to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Thomas. Liz?
I can definitely agree with Thomas on the bit about finding out where you are now. And as Becky says, the best time to have done your baselining was a long time ago, but failing that, get on and do it now, so that you actually do know where you are, not only because that means you can think about what potential new income streams there might be, but also how you can increase your business's resilience and your ability to reduce emissions, because generally reducing greenhouse gas emissions does go hand in hand with certainly reducing exposure to risks from volatile input markets, things like that. So there's a reason for doing it in and of itself. But the kind of questions I would say farmers should be asking, and in fact Isaac kind of touched on it. If you're going to enter the voluntary carbon market, how is this really going to affect my ability as a farmer to carry on my core business? Or actually, am I going to trade and cease being a farmer in exchange for the kind of payments that are on offer? Because certainly the higher levels of payment generally do mean that land will move over to more nature-based solutions, which, as Isaac says, if you leave it for 99 years, you will have a forest. It's inevitable, quite frankly. Then the question is, are they paying you enough? And I think in that question, you also have to look at, and in fact, always read the small print to find out what any particular customer wants now and in the future. Because certainly, and I've seen it, some people have actually tried to work it out, because any verification requirements, and I don't think there's any verification business is going to give you a fixed price to do that verification work for the next 99 years, and that it will not get cheaper as the years go by. And you also need to think about how it's going to affect the value if you decide to sell at any point during the life of that scheme, because effectively you are selling an encumbered asset. So, you won't better have your cake and eat it, I suppose, is really what I'm saying. But certainly reading that small print is really important. And then the final thing I think I'd say is this bit about, if I sell carbon credits, what does that do to the emissions picture on my farm business? Because certainly it's not going to make you a lower emissions producer. And then I think that's all about how this insetting versus offsetting moves forward. And I think probably for farmers, though, the really critical part in all this, and I think we are starting to find ways of properly valuing this, is that the customers that farmers sell to, most of them have signed up, the bigger ones have signed up to some kind of commitment under SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative, and they are going to have to come good on those commitments. And that means they do need to have visibility and some ability to report on the carbon storage that's going on farm in order to offset the emissions within their whole supply chain. And potentially that will make farmers, not only will it be a postcode lottery in the future as to whether you can get a good dairy contract, but also potentially just how good you are at removing carbon will be part of that conversation as well.
Thank you.
Going.
Thank you. Does anybody want to explain the difference between offsetting and insetting? Oh, you mentioned it, Liz.
Yeah, I did. I'll have a crack. I mean, insetting simply means using that carbon storage within either your own business or your own supply chain rather than selling it away. That's my understanding of it. I don't know, Thomas, you're nodding. I mean, I think that's really what it's about. I mean, as a farmer myself, I need to inset my own emissions through storing carbon on the farm. And, we talk about it, this whole sort of race towards net zero. And I think the one thing I would say in this space is net zero is not, it's kind of a milestone on the way, because it doesn't happen one day and then your business stays at net zero, because the following year, as a farmer, you will still be producing emissions from your farming activity, and then you're going to have to find another lot of storage of carbon to offset that. You can't rely on what you offset last year. I think that's something that probably we need to get our heads around a bit better.
And the danger of offsetting on behalf of somebody else is that you then might not be able to offset your own emissions.
Well, precisely.
Isaac, I know Thomas is nodding, but could you just sort of explain that the risk of doing that, what might seem like a very attractive financial proposition, again, might come back and bite you at a later date?
Yes. So let's say you enter into a contract with a bank and you say, I'm going to offset your emissions, or you enter, in fact, let's say you enter into a contract with a law firm and you say, I'm going to offset all of the paper Isaac prints out when he's reading his contracts. Brilliant. Isaac prints off a lot of paper, so you've got a lovely big payment happening every year for that. Unfortunately, you've also got a dairy contract with a supermarket, and they say, I'd like to know that you're not producing any carbon, overall from your farm when you sell me your dairy. And you say, of course I'm not. Look at all of these trees that I'm planting and these meadows that I'm creating. And they say, hold on a minute. Isaac's been printing all of those trees and all of those fields. So actually, your milk, despite coming from a farm which is having an overall net benefit, doesn't get to count as being carbon neutral. And it's if you sell those certificates, then you need to go and buy new ones. And that is essentially greenwashing. And we see this a lot of the time with renewable energy contracts. So the example is, you put solar panels on your roof, you sell to one of the big energy suppliers the certificates that come with those solar panels, and you say, you know, Mr. or Mrs. Energy Supplier, you can tell your customers that you're buying green electricity because I gave you my certificate. And then on your website, you say all of our business is powered by solar power.
Yeah.
It's true, but it's not the whole truth.
Yeah.
That's the risk.
Yeah. And certainly now within calculators, the new guidance means that if you're a farm business and you put panels on your roof and you sold the electricity, that does not go into your footprint because it can't.
Yeah. Although it's not, you're not greenwashing if you're keeping it in your business and then if you're letting the supermarket claim that, then you're not greenwashing. But that's in setting.
Thank you. Thomas, you're nodding. Anything to add?
Yeah, absolutely. This is like a fundamentally important thing of all carbon accounting, let's say, is the need not to double count effectively, which is what we're talking about now. So like, you know, you can't sell some carbon credits to, you know, Isaac, and then also go and claim to Tesco's that you're carbon neutral, right? Maybe you can if you're storing enough carbon, but you need to be able to understand and document that, right? So, but this is where and I really think we are coming to an age now where there's going to be, you know, we have accountants that are kind of audited to deliver HMRC the documentation they need. We are going to get into the position where we have to have the kind of equivalent carbon accountants effectively that look at your balance sheet of carbon effectively at the end of the year and go, okay, this is your balance sheet at the end of the year. Maybe you're got a surplus, maybe you've got who knows, kind of depends how you sit. And obviously if you sold some of that obviously comes into the equation. But and this is where I think, which is what Agrina does really well, to be honest, is we need to be able to document that, but we also need to be able to be interoperable, because some fields, let's for example say you're an arable farming business, you've got some fields that, to be honest, the supply chain couldn't care less what the carbon footprint is, and those fields that year are fully eligible and you could sell credits from them should you want to, right? But maybe the next year you go and plant some, I don't know, milling wheat on it, and there's some bread company that would really love to have carbon neutral wheat. That year is probably best if you give that data and kind of sell that carbon potential through to the bread company, so they can, you know, put on their packets they're carbon neutral. And this is going to be fundamentally crucial, and this is what we built our infrastructure on effectively, is that interoperability of 1 year you need to have access one market, 1 year you need to access a different market, and you need to be able to account for that and audit that to slightly different standards and stuff each year. So that's effectively what we do with all of our farmers we work with now. Is each year we run a carbon account of your field. We do it on a field by field basis. Some fields, some years go to the supply chain, some fields, some years go to the offset market, and to account for that and audit for that really properly is really crucial, mostly because we need to be able to maximize the income the farmer can get. If you go to a farmer and go, look, this field must be in a big contract to always give the carbon to a bread company, we know that field doesn't always produce wheat. So like, it makes no sense that field should always do that. So it's this kind of interoperability and accounting of what the balance each year is going to be more and more crucial.
I'd add to that, Thomas, as well, this whole idea of carbon registries in order to avoid double counting, because you think about it, unless that data is transparent and visible, then it's all too easy to sell the same thing to two different people, and it does invalidate the sale, obviously. And we've got registries in some sectors, but I don't think, Isaac, we've currently got a UK registry, do we, for carbon, for voluntary carbon market?
No, not an official one. That can be independently audited. There's some interesting work people are doing with blockchain technology. I think that there was a phase where if you wanted to have a successful startup business, you said the word blockchain three times.
Not anymore.
Not anymore, no. Well, if you say AI now, that's how it gets you.
Yes.
But AI, blockchain, ESG, and that's my business sorted. I think it's really interesting what Thomas is saying, because it almost sounds like you're farming carbon. You know, you've got your annual yield of carbon from your different fields, and then you're saying, well, do I sell this in my contract to my bread company, or do I sell it on the open market to whoever wants to come and buy it? And this is, on the one hand, I think it does seem quite different to what farmers normally do, and on the other, it's exactly what you've been doing for hundreds of years. And I think lawyers, it's always the lawyers, maybe the bankers as well, but we try and make it sound more complicated because, you know, that partly that's just in our nature, we can't help it, but also because we're used to kind of it doesn't seem complicated to us because it's a financial model that we understand. And I think that's where it can be really important to speak to a lawyer and your farm manager, and then professionals like Thomas and Liz about how is this really going to work, and actually what am I using my land to produce. And if you're using your land to produce certificates, try and look past the certificate and the wordiness and the lawyer and see, actually what I'm doing is I'm producing carbon, flood management, biodiversity, and earlier I did mention about stacking. One of the things that is difficult to stack, very difficult to stack with, is biodiversity net gain credits, and that's because that's in one of these non-voluntary markets. But broadly, voluntary side of things, you can stack lots of stuff on top of each other.
Yeah.
But it's always worth asking your lawyer or your professional advisor, can I do both of these things at the same time? Because if you can't, there is liability. You know, you've got to imagine you've sold your biodiversity net gain credits, you put the land aside for that, you tell your bread company this is all carbon neutral wheat. Turns out it isn't. The bread company is the person at the end of the year needing to pay 300 quid a ton for the carbon. That's going to come back on you in your contract. And, you know, that's where before you enter the contract, it's worth talking to the lawyers to make sure, it's all permitted.
And Thomas, I'd sort of add to that, because if you're kind of literally looking each year at which is the best market to sell your carbon into, how does that, I mean, can you explain how you deal with the need for that carbon storage to be pegged to a place and to be permanently there, at least or is the permanence only 1 year in terms of the credit trades that you're doing?
Before you answer that question, we've got about 3 minutes left. So keep it. And I have one more question, which will be, while you answer that, have a think of one sort of takeaway message for people who've tuned in, as it were, to this webinar. But yeah, go.
Okay, I'll try and do both of those things at the same time. So, Liz, yeah, like your fundamental, like, you know, that we also said in this webinar, right? Permanence is like a key part of the carbon market, so we need to make sure it's permanent. Obviously, kind of your emissions and carbon footprint, that's not really to do with permanency. What we're talking about with permanency is the kind of physical storage of carbon in soils, the removals of it from the atmosphere, right? So, like, there's a few, like, we haven't got much time, but there's a few different ways that we can manage that. The first way is with a kind of risk buffer type pool system. And the second way is also fundamentally with scale, to be honest.
Okay.
If you really try and look at this, you know, on an individual field or 2 fields basis, it's really difficult to make the accountants work up, and it kind of comes back to that financial modeling. But if you look at this over, you know, 4 million, 5 million, 10 million hectares, you know, it kind of becomes an insurance pool, right? The risk of default effectively is kind of what you start to talk about, and the risk of default in agricultural systems like this is pretty low. So we can kind of balance it in that way. But we can talk about it later if you want.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And your takeaway message, Thomas?
Yeah, my takeaway message, I think, is not going to surprise anybody, is don't worry about trading. We all talk about trading too much. What you really need to fundamentally worry about is understanding your current position, your baseline, and your potential, and worry about trading once you've done that.
Thank you, Thomas. Liz, I'm going to go to you next, if
Okay.
I may.
Well, I guess, I mean, given FCT is who I work for, I agree that actually the first thing to do, if you do nothing else, just wander onto our website, have a look and just see what data you need to put into the calculator. And I would say that the accuracy of the report you get out will be wholly dependent upon the accuracy and completeness of the data you put in. And we stand ready to help you as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Liz. And Isaac, your takeaway message for everybody?
The only way I'm going to make money is if you do think about trading, but I'm going to upset my bosses by saying Thomas is right. Get your baselines in first. And if you're interested in trading, find me on the internet, send me an email, and be very happy to help you talking about that.
Nice. Thank you very much. Thanks, Isaac. And yeah, thank you for to everybody for your honesty, your openness, and for I guess expressing what is a very difficult and can be a very complicated and mystifying subject in simple terms that even I can understand. So that's always going to be good. We're going to have to go. But everybody who has watched this webinar, thank you very much. It will be made available on demand. So if you really want to, you can watch it all again. But if there's somebody else that you think would benefit from watching it, please do point them in our direction. We will put links on the website so that people, if you wanted to get more information from any of our three panelists, you'll be able to do so as well. But to Liz Bowles, Chief Executive of the Farm Carbon Toolkit, Isaac Murdy, Solicitor with Shakespeare Martineau, and Thomas Gent, UK Market Lead for Agreener. Thank you very much for your time this evening and your expertise and for sharing your thoughts with us. We will be back again soon after the new year with another Farmers Weekly Transition webinar. But for now, I'm Johan Tasker. I've been your host this evening. Thank you very much and good night. Thank you.
Thanks, Johan.